Okay, welcome to the SOCAN Forest and Fire group meeting for the 17th of March, 2022. It's a great pleasure for us to be able to welcome Charisse Sidoriak, who has been working on a project identifying plants that are resistant to fire, or maybe the word is reluctant to be burned, and Charisse will clarify all of that. Quick word about Charisse for those who have not encountered her. She comes to us from all kinds of positions with various agencies, national parks and BLM, and is currently acting as the leader of the Southern Oregon Climate Smart Working Group, which is a working group that was launched by SOCAN, actually by this Forest and Fire group, but is now an independent inter-organizational group that's working on promoting the ideas of climate smart natural resource management. And it's with a great pleasure that we have invited, Charisse, I should say, it's a great pleasure for us that Charisse has agreed to talk to us about her project and help us understand what it is she's doing. So without more ado, I'll turn the microphone over to Charisse and let her go. And if she wants to say more about herself, she can do that too.
Thank you, Alan. I don't really need to say more. Perhaps I should say that I'm working on this project to, as part of my responsibilities with the Ashland Wildfire Safety Commission. I'm on the Landscaping Working Group, and I'm also a member of the Medford Wildfire Mitigation Steering Committee, who is developing a plant list for Medford. And those combined responsibilities got me interested in researching what it meant to have fire-resistant landscaping. And you will find out what I found in this presentation. So I would prefer to do this in person. I find that its interactiveness in Zoom is lacking. I cannot see you when I'm making these presentations. So put your questions in the chat rather than shouting out at this point, and I will make sure to monitor that. And there will be one or two places where I ask you questions, and since I can't see you, you will also have to shout out. So to appreciate why certain recommendations are made relative to fire-resistant landscaping, it's a good idea to have a foundation in fire dynamics. So I'm going to show you a few slides, maybe a dozen at most, to provide context for the fire-resistant landscaping best practices that I will be recommending to you. The first fundamental is to understand how fire works. The fire triangle on this slide shows three things that must be present for fire to occur: an ignition source, heat, fuel, and oxygen. In addition to reviewing the fundamentals of fire dynamics, I'll also cover three topics listed on the slide: primary and secondary causes of ignition in an urban environment, why urban environments are particularly susceptible to intense, fast-spreading wildfire, and the reasons for designating hazard ignition zones. So fire is a chemical reaction that starts with lightning, lava, or a match. Heat is propagated or transferred from one body to another through conduction, convection, and radiation. Conductive heating occurs when an object is in direct contact with a heated item, such as the prong over the logs in this picture. Convective heating occurs when an object is heated by rising air. And radiated heating occurs when a heated object makes another object heat up through energetic transfer. The second leg of the fire triangle is oxygen. If the air mass is still, burning is primarily accomplished through conductive heating. When the air mass is moving, combustion is facilitated by conductive, convective, and radiant heating. An important factor in the behavior of the Almeida fire was the abundance of oxygen caused by strong, sustained winds. And the third component of the fire triangle is fuel. Homes are fuel in the urban landscape, as are the landscapes that surround them. So what is the primary source of ignition in an urban environment? Embers, also called firebrands, are the spark that ignites fuels as far as 1 to 5 miles away from the active flaming fire. A lot of people envision fires burning environments like cities in a massive flaming front. The truth is, embers start the fires in cities for the most part. A blizzard of embers like the shower shown in the left-hand picture rains down on the homes and on the surrounding vegetation. Any receptive fuels can then burst into flame as shown in the gutters of this house and next to the walls of the house. Both are burning on vegetation, needles from trees, bark mulch, plants. The second phase of ignition is caused by latent heating, when many embers over time dry out the bark mulch, in this case on the right side picture, and overlying shrubs. In a time, that shrub next to the post of a stairway could ignite when the shrub ignites, generating conductive, convective, and radiant heat to the structure. In situations where an ember storm is inundating a large area, firefighting resources will not be able to stop the ignition of all the homes in a community due to both causes of ignition: an ember blizzard lighting a bunch of stuff on fire, and then the time where everything cooks, dries out, and then ignites. So why are urban landscapes vulnerable? Why do some homes succumb to wildfire and others don't? In this picture, you can see 3 homes next to each other that are on fire, 2 homes that aren't. Sometimes it has to do with luck. Other times it's due to local air eddies, such as happens in the eye of a hurricane. And other times it's due to property owners' personal investment in preparing their property. To better understand urban environmental vulnerabilities, it's necessary to talk about what drives fire behavior. The fire behavior triangle graphically shows 3 components which drive fire behavior: weather and climate, topography, and fuels. Of the 3, weather and climate is the most variable, least predictable, and least controllable by humans. Fuel is a component shared by both triangles. And topography is the 3rd leg of the fire behavior triangle. I'm going to focus briefly on elements of the fuel and topography that are fundamental to why homes burn in an urban environment. Urban fuels consist of densely packed homes surrounded by vegetation. This situation creates a large fuel load. In addition, urban homes and landscapes contain vast quantities of highly volatile materials in many shapes and sizes. What makes the urban environment unique, in my mind, is that the fuels are arranged horizontally and vertically, which I will show you. Appreciating how fuel components affect ignition potential and fire spread and intensity can help you better design and maintain a fire-resistant landscape. So here are some pictures of horizontally continuous fuels in my town, Ashland. There is a river of bark mulch leading up to the walls of a house by a porch, a wave of juniper shrubs in front of a house and next to the house, and then wooden fencing that connects houses. Those conduits or pathways for heating of the home are a major cause of ignition in an urban environment. Vertically continuous fuel load is usually created by the vegetation surrounding our homes. Shrubs and trees often containing abundant dead fuels, and during the height of the fire season, relatively low fuel moisture in their leaves. A spreading ground fire transfers heat to shrubs and small trees, through which direct flame contact or convective and radiant heating causes the fire to move into the canopy of the trees and eaves of the house. In the picture to the left, the vegetation is close enough to the windows of the first and second stories of the house. Regular window glass can break at 170 degrees. These windows would likely break, allowing embers and heat to ignite the interior of the house before the fire even climbs into the nearby canopy. The term for this phenomenon is called ladder fuels, just in case you hadn't heard that before, where pine needles, perhaps on the ground on the right at the bottom transfers heats to the smaller shrubs, bigger shrubs, and eventually up into the trees or the house. The reason I'm emphasizing this is that spacing really matters in fire-resistant landscaping. Note that a 2-foot tall shrub can generate enough convective heat to ignite vegetation 6 feet above the shrub. That is why you'll hear me recommend that mature conifer trees have their lower limbs pruned up to 10 feet from the ground or from any shrub. It should be at least 6 feet higher than the shrub. And no flammable plants should be planted under a conifer tree since they are highly flammable. The distance between shrubs also matters, or plants, not just shrubs. A 2-foot tall shrub should be 4 feet apart from another 2-foot tall shrub. Fire behavior is also strongly affected by terrain or topography. The direction a hill faces affects the amount of sunlight it receives. Generally, south-facing slopes receive more sunlight that leads to drier fuels. A wildfire burning on a south-facing aspect is likely to be more intense because of greater radiant heating and naturally drier conditions. The shape of the land and position of a fire on the landscape affects fire behavior. A fire burning on a flat is driven by the prevailing wind direction. A fire burning in a canyon can be a lot like a fire burning in a chimney where the heated air is funneled up a flue. A house at the bottom of a valley or on the top of a ridge experiences different daytime and nighttime temperatures and moisture regimes and diurnal winds. These differences affect the flammability of the vegetation and fire behavior. So I'm going to emphasize again that slope matters a lot. Slope affects how fuels are heated. On steep slopes, the fuels are tilted toward the flaming front, making it much easier for the preheating and drying of fuels just ahead of the fire. This preheating of fuels allows fire to move much more quickly up slopes than down. So if fuels below this house had been thinned out and possibly a retaining wall separating the vegetation from the house down the slope, the retaining wall built on the slope below the house could have deflected some of the heat so that the house would not burn. So research on how homes ignite has found that if certain precautions are taken relative to structures at risk due to fire, that risk can be substantially reduced. The primary residence is usually the thing of greatest value on a property and therefore the center of our attention. Hazard ignition zones are like concentric circles radiating out from the home, which may have accessory structures like a deck, patio, garage, or stairway. The first step to reduce risk is hardening the home. I'm not going to cover home hardening techniques in this presentation, but I would be happy to if there are questions at the end. For the most part, the one item I'm going to mention is that vents are a pathway into the home from the outside, and vent screens of 1/4 inch in diameter would allow embers to enter the home, and vegetation and bark mulch located near the base of the house where there's 1/4 inch foundation vent covers, that's the norm from the past 20 or 30 years, would allow heat embers to enter the bottom of a house if it has a basement with foundation vents. So see the red line around the house on the upper left or right and the deck. There's a 0 to 5 foot HIZ. It's a red line. Nothing combustible should be located in this zone. If there's one thing you can do to protect your home, is to address vents, roof, and make sure nothing combustible is within 5 feet of your house on flat ground. You have to double it for every 20% of slope. So no cardboard, leaves, plants, furniture, planters with plants in them, 0 to 5 feet from the house. And then there's something that I think I'm the only one who uses this term, the 5 to 10 foot zone. You don't see this in any of the defensible space flyers. They usually jump from 5 to 30 feet. But the reason I am now proposing that we really look hard at the 5 to 10 foot zone is that I discovered in my research that you cannot plant any evergreen shrubs of any type between the home and 30 feet out if you only use the 0 to 5 criteria and the 5 to 30. But if you go 10 feet out, you can sparingly plant some evergreen shrubs in the 10 to 30 foot zone. Another thing to remember about this particular situation is in some brochures, they recommend that if the house has hardy backer or cement board siding, the 0 to 5 zone is just as I described, nothing combustible. But if you have wood siding, that zone should be 0 to 10 feet with nothing combustible in it. So the traditional brochures that you will see will have the 0 to 5, 5 to 30, and then something called the 30 to 100. So the 5 to 30 is where you're not supposed to plant any flammable plants, and you do the most care and maintenance of your yard. From 30 to 100 feet, it's highly recommended that you thin the vegetation down because it means that the fire can be a surface fire rather than a crown fire moving toward the house, radiating heat. But in an urban environment, like this picture shows, most homes are 5, 10, 20 feet apart. So that 0 to 30 foot prescription for hazard ignition zone means that they overlap with your neighbors, which means that their vegetation, their landscaping vegetation, affects your vegetation and your home. So you need to work with neighbors to recognize hazard ignition zones are a community issue. So now I'm really going to get into the topic that we originally built this class for, which was fire-resistant landscaping. The topics I'm going to cover are characteristics of the least and most flammable plants, landscaping best practices, fire-resistant landscaping design, and plant selection. Based on what I just presented to you, looking at this picture, take your mute off. What do you see in this picture relative to landscape design that gives you pause?
Wooden fencing.
The wooden fencing, good one. There's also bark mulch next to the wooden fencing.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
And flammable vegetation sitting right there.
And that flammable vegetation is one of the arch enemies of landscaping in a fire-prone environment. It's an arborvitae. They're extremely flammable. And in this particular picture, which I took when I was doing a wildfire risk assessment in Ashland just about 2 weeks ago, this was a flipped house, and this is how they landscaped the property. That house that's on the other side of the fence did not put this wooden fence up, but it threatens them. Not a good plan. And then this fence wraps all the way around and attaches to the house that the person just purchased. And they planted prohibited plants in the backyard next to a wooden fence. Not a good plan. So let me get into the basics of fire-resistant vegetation. All plants will burn. And I call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good are plants that are fire reluctant. And that term is a term I'm actually trying to promote over fire resistant for this reason. In fire ecology, fire resistance refers to plants that recover after a fire, like they resprout or they are resistant to burning because they have thick bark. It has become common practice to call fire resistant landscaping fire resistant rather than fire reluctant, which is a better description of what we are actually looking for. Fire reluctant plants are plants that are slow to ignite, slow to burn, and burn less intensely than other plants. So when we're doing landscaping, we're looking for the fire reluctant species. The bad plants are those that are flammable. They're easier to ignite. They can be moderately or highly flammable. And the ugly are the explosive plants. They have such structure and design and content of chemicals and moisture that they burn explosively. And let's look at those characteristics now. If you still have your mics off, what would you say would be a fire reluctant plant? What qualities would it have?
A lot of
Any ideas?
moisture.
Soil content.
I couldn't
And,
hear that.
I said low oil content. Probably the leaf structure is, yeah, that's where the low oil in the leaves, which is kind of the same thing, and also the bark.
Okay.
That's kind of one thing.
So what I heard was that it would have, I think I heard a higher moisture content, which would mean, because you have to drive off moisture to get something to burn. It doesn't have fine texture. Let's look at this simple graphic here. So it usually doesn't retain dead material. They're usually small or open in form and do not accumulate dead twigs and branches. And I think Gary said they don't have an oily content. That's hard for people to figure out. Sometimes you can, if you smell odor, it's an indication that they have a lot of volatile oils. They don't have resins. The key to flammability testing is they test whether they have high soap or saponin content, latex, salt, or water, and their size. Those are the key ingredients when they do flammability tests. And another one that I think is appropriate in a changing climate is they're not prone to disease, and they can survive higher average temperatures in the future. So what is the bad? It's the opposite. Just to point this out, they tend to be massive, sprawling, or dense in structure. If you can put your fist through a plant pretty easily, it means it's not very dense. But so many of our landscaping plants, especially hedges, are just dense with interior dead material and exterior greenness. If you can have difficulty putting your hand through that plant, your fist, it's probably highly flammable. It also could have characteristics like feathery leaves, shreddy bark, needles. It contains volatile oils, waxes, terpenes, and other flammable chemicals. And another thing is that generally, if it has an invasive habit, it produces a lot of fuel. You don't want things that climb going up your trees or on your houses. So ivy, things like that are just not good plants for fire-resistant landscaping. And then the ugly. And the ugly plants light very quickly. And when they burn explosively. Examples are bamboo, pampas grass, massed ornamental grasses, which have become very popular in the last couple of decades, brooms, arborvitae, juniper, cedar, or cypress. And while Ashland currently says that you can have dwarf varieties, they're still highly flammable and are not recommended. So after this presentation, I'd like to send you a fire-resistant landscaping best practices handout. It's 2 pages long, and it kind of summarizes all of these things that you should be thinking about when you're doing fire-resistant landscaping. I'm going to cover a couple of the points here. First of all, follow plant siting guidelines. That's why I spent so much time on the hazard ignition zones. It really matters where things are placed. Remove flammable vegetation within 30 feet of structures and from under trees and shrubs. Avoid planting anything within 5 feet of structures, although I can recommend some plants in that space because of their high water content and low flammability testing. And plant only fire-reluctant plants within 10 feet of structures, and they should be dominant in the whole 10 to 30 foot zone as well. Emphasize plants that don't grow over 2 feet tall within 30 feet of your home. Emphasize deciduous trees and shrubs, but plant them sparingly so that you don't create a continuous fuel load. No evergreen shrubs or trees within 10 feet, and again, plant sparingly. Eliminate combustible mulches within 30 feet of structures, or if you have them, isolate them in small beds. Avoid mass planting and keep the soils and plants vigorous and healthy. You need to select the right plants. So essentially, selecting the right plants are what we've already talked about in terms of key characteristics. They're well adapted to local conditions, which is one reason why emphasizing natives can be a good thing, although don't plant the highly flammable natives. They don't retain dead leaves for more than 2 months of the year. They don't accumulate dead twigs and branches. They don't have waxy, oily, resinous, or odorous leaves. They have high salt, soap, or latex content, and have high water content throughout the fire season. I do want to point out that water content changes seasonally, even diurnally, so it's a hard thing to gauge. But in general, things that have higher water content, like a succulent, are less flammable as long as they don't accumulate a lot of dead materials within their mass. And do not select plants that are prone to disease, like Dutch elm's disease, and do not have invasive qualities. Some of you may be aware that there was a combustible mulches study done in Nevada. Here are the results of that study and a link to where you can get it yourself. And what I want to emphasize on this slide is look at the far left. The most combustible mulch is shredded rubber. It burns with the highest temperature. It doesn't spread very quickly, but it has also a high flame length. Can you see my arrow when I'm doing this? I'm not hearing an answer. I'll assume you can.
No.
The next one over is pine needles. Well, they don't burn that hotly as compared to everything else. They have a fast rate of spread and a relatively long flame length. And the third category of most flammable is shredded Western red cedar. We're in the Pacific Northwest, and we are often offered the opportunity to spread bark mulches, particularly things like shredded Western red cedar, on our properties. And that it really should not be continued any longer. And if you have these combustible mulches within 30 feet of your house, I recommend that you remove them or isolate them in small patches and cover them with very fine compost, which is not flammable or barely flammable. These other categories here in the middle have to do with a product that's made in Nevada, so we won't really go over that. And the last one here is composted wood chips as the least flammable in this group. Mulch is important to keeping soils healthy. So finding these alternatives is great. What you will hear most of the time is compost with gravel, pavers. And while that can work to some extent, it also might mean that you desertify or you make your landscape quite unattractive. But you can use those inorganic materials to isolate beds of compostable mulches. So in this presentation, I've mentioned fire dynamics and slope, and I just want to remind you that if you have all of these recommendations are relative to flat terrain. On a slope of 0 to 20%, you should try to space your shrubs 2 times the height of the shrub. On a 20 to 40% slope, the distance should be 4 times greater. And at a 40% slope, the distance between plants should be 6 times further. And I'm going to start getting into plant selection, but before I do, I want you to understand something that's problematic on plant lists is that sometimes they list an entire genus of plant as fire resistant. In my research, I found that's often erroneous. Plant size and growth form can make a big difference. So try to go with fire resistant plants that are smaller and that are actually proven to be low flammability. Now, this is probably the most where plants are placed and how they are maintained is more important than the type of plant selected. Proper plant care and continual maintenance is critical. So if you have a densely planted landscape and don't maintain it, you're asking for trouble. So it's better to be not overplant and to be diligent in plant care. That's more important than almost anything else you can do in fire-resistant landscaping. The next thing that you should think about is fire-reluctant landscape design. I've mentioned all the fuel components and hazard flammability components, but developing a landscape plan, you should look at three things: your desired values. I'll show a couple of those in a minute. The shape of the land and fuel components of the plants. So what are the common values desired in a landscape? Beauty, fragrance, all of those things that are listed. Sometimes you want to have deer resistance. You want to have food that you can produce for your family. But there's generally a great deal of interest in providing habitat or food for wildlife. And we can have it all in fire-resistant landscaping if you pick the right plants. I'm going to show you a real quick case study of a property that was being newly landscaped in Ashland, where we took a look at the home, and this is their landscaping plan. The colors represent the 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and out to 30 feet. They had a suite of plant selections, but one thing I'm going to point out right here is they didn't look at the shape of the land. Right here is a ravine running south to north. Fires could easily come from the south and be intense. The topo lines are close together, so there's a lot of slope. And they propose planting densely, right in here in particular, clustered ornamental grasses. So I just took a quick look at this and I started pointing these things out. Here's a picture where I said, what are the scientific names of these plants so that I can look them up, which I did. And I didn't, this is not a complete review of the project, but I pointed out that these are highly flammable plants that they suggest planting within 5 to 10 feet of the home. In this case, this is a pine, a limber pine, actually out just on the property line of the property. There's not somebody else's property right here on a slope where fire could easily spread up and move to and burn this, cause this house to burn. So landscape design matters. And a major shortcoming of all fire-resistant plant lists is there is no standardized methodology for testing flammability and assigning plants to prescribed hazard ignition zones. There are none in Oregon that do this, that I found. Fire-resistant plant lists frequently say different things or say nothing at all about where a plant should be located to be considered safe or fire-wise. But there appears to be universal consensus that where plants are planted and how they are maintained is more important than the type of plant selected. So why should we even bother considering using fire-resistant plant lists? Because local and regional fire-wise plant lists often make no spacing recommendations and provide conflicting advice. So what should we do? In response to that dilemma, I started investigating plants. And I decided that the value of a fire-resistant plant list is that it can guide plant selection so homeowners and residents don't unintentionally plant highly flammable species. Many property owners and tenants don't have the capacity to tease out the differences between highly reluctant or fire-reluctant and highly flammable plants. So what can we tell them? What can you do? Follow fire-resistant landscaping best practices. I'm going to give you that handout. Choose plants that have low flammability characteristics. And to help you do that, I created the fire-reluctant plant list generator tool. And then I encourage everyone to do their own research. So do you need a break or should I continue in introducing this tool?
I'm fine.
Okay.
Me too. I keep going.
So Okay, so this fire resistant plant list generator currently has over 680 plants listed in it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is a picture of the database right here, but it actually has other screens. You don't necessarily need to use the tool by looking at this information, but all of the sources for every attribution, almost all, I probably missed some, is included in this database so that you could actually go to the source. I'm circling source information right here in the reference section of the database. When you use the tool, you have the option of choosing, I mean, it probably is hundreds of different combinations right now, which can be easily abused. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples on how to take care in your choices. It's driven by hazard ignition zone, your choice of lists. I have something called Sharice's list, which is a list that I basically, based on research, feel comfortable recommending, but I'm also telling everyone to look at the consider list as well. Conflict is where some of the plants might never go on to the recommended list, and some may. I need other people to work with me to help make those decisions. And then the other thing that this database contains is a list of attributions that basically landscapers and the public want to know. How big does it grow? What kind of plant is it? What water needs? Is it native? Is it invasive? Is it deer resistant? Can I use it for screening? What are the wildlife benefits? And is it available in local nurseries? Not all of those attribute filters are completely populated, but they're ready to be. So I'm going to show you the plant list generator right now. If you're interested in using it, on the handout that I can provide to you, you will find these web addresses. Livingwithfire.org is my personal website, where I put in a lot of information on fire in all categories: insurance, statistics, all of that kind of stuff. And if you're interested in helping to populate the database, please contact me. I need several people to help me make this work. Okay, so I'm going to now show you the generator. I hope this works. For some reason, I'm not getting it to stop sharing. Hold on.
It's stopped now. You're good.
Okay, now the reason I was taking time is that when I generate products, if I go on the screen share, you can see the products as I produce them. That might not happen now. So the first screen is an introduction to the plant list generator with a tab to it's, you know, the background behind it, etc. The next screen gives you a quick start guide with some rules of thumb on how to use it. And let me get this out of the way. And then if you go to the master database, you'll see what I showed you in one slide. So let's do an experiment. I'm going to, this tells you what the first screen does, which is basically it says, what are you going to filter on? And right now I have it set up to filter on the 5 to 10 zone, Sharice's list, ground cover. What would you like to know about? I can make it up. Let me do shrubs, or no, any plant. And this is something I want you to look at. Here it says 102 matching plants are found in the 10 to 30 foot zone. If I want to know which of those plants are native. There are 13 plants found in that zone so far. Something's wrong right now in terms of the numbers, but this will still work. So I want to show in the report, the printout that I have, the flammability notes on those 13 native plants. What structure do they have? Are they drought tolerant? I don't need to say native because I already did. Do they have wildlife value, and are they deer resistant? And you can print it out in Word or Excel. Are you seeing any of this happening?
Yeah,
Okay. Now,
Yes, we're watching.
I don't know that you'll see. Can you see the list? Or do I have to
that's,
stop? What?
don't see a list.
Okay, so
This
I'm going to
point.
stop sharing. I have had a hard time figuring out how to juggle between being on Zoom, generating lists, and showing you the products of the list. But here's an example of the list that got printed out. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So you can see at the top, it says, okay, these are native plants right here, ground cover in the 10 to 30 foot zone. And anybody can go and look at this database and use it right now if they go to my webpage, and they will see whatever results they choose to generate. In this case, let's look at Antonaria microphylla, little leaf rosy pussy toes. It's a ground cover, but you can see that it also, because I picked plant structure, it's also considered a perennial herb or evergreen, this Armeria maritima. According to my research, it requires low water, and this is a problem. Every single source has different ways of classifying water and flammability. So I try to pick things that I think are generally represented by a reputable source, but all of the source information is in there. And if it conflicts within the database, I actually have a conflict knob that I can hit. And you'll notice here, I'm going to go back to the generator so you can see this better. Wildlife sum. Wildlife comes in many forms. Pollinators, birds, mammals, etc. Anytime I find a source that says one of those forms of wildlife benefits, and pollinators, they have two things. They could be a host plant or a nectar plant. They each get a value of 1, so that you can actually get a summary score of how many wildlife benefits occur. So here's kind of a superstar in our native category, Armeria maritima sea thrift. 5 sources claim this species is fire resistant. 1 source says it's suitable to plant within 5 feet of structures. The Idaho testing lab advises 30 feet from structures. It's moderate to low water requirement. It has wildlife value, and it's deer resistant. Okay. So I am periodically now getting calls from people to say, well, is X plant fire resistant or not? And I can go to my database and look it up, and I'll send them my notes. Whether it's completely right or wrong, what I am trying to do is empower people to make informed choices, rather than having an institution say, this is what you should plant. So is there anything else you want to see in that generator? You want me to call up and do another search?
Yeah, try another one. It looks as though what we really need to do is to, if we want to learn something, is to go into it and play with it.
Exactly. I'm trying to get it so that it's easier to go back and forth. So are you seeing the generator tool again? Or just the
Yeah.
printout? Okay, so I think I've got it so I can show you both at the same time. So I'm going to go back. And the reason I had so few plants, it was I had selected ground cover. I could pick, I have a category I've added in called unsuitable, meaning that I intend on advising the cities of Ashland and Medford to prohibit these plants in city limits. Let's see. Do you want to look at what plants are pollinator friendly?
Okay.
Here.
Actually, pollinator friendly is one of those wiggle words that I don't like to use. There's no bats that we know of. And I clicked all of these to filter on, and look what happens down here. Only 3 plants match all those criteria. So at this point, I am just going to go with, I want to know all the plants that have, all the plants that I've identified. By the way, I have asked BCD USA to help me identify all the plants on the consider list that are pollinator friendly. And because I've selected all of those, I don't need to have necessarily deer resistance or water or drought, what kind of plants, what their notes are. Let's just go and see what this does. Now, do you see this printout?
Yes.
Yes, it's
Okay,
come in.
so I
Yeah,
did it
perfect.
successfully. Oh, I left on natives. So these are natives that create pollinator food. I could go back and undo that.
We like natives.
It's just, it limits the search. So there's now 210 plants, 65 of which were native. So if you're interested in playing with this tool, you can download it onto your computer. As I said, it's not interactive online. That takes a lot of money to make it happen, and nobody is hosting it. So you have to download it from my page, then you can run it, and then you can sign up to be notified when it's updated. So you can re-download. So these are the species so far that have been identified as being pollinator food. And there's up here in the top, it says 210 plants. So you can see that the ways of searching are incredibly varied.
Mhm.
There are a couple of species that I'm really struggling with in terms of recommending. For example, the Yarrows. Here's one that was on the Medford list, so the proposed Medford list. It's an Oregon native. One source says it's fire resistant, and you'd have to go back to my database to find out who did, but didn't assign an HIZ. I believe it was the OSU publication on, oh, it was a Redmond, Oregon publication, OSU. And another source claims this species is extremely flammable. So do we recommend this to people? Those are the kind of decisions to be made.
It seems to me that there's a lot of information, and and that picking a choice that, a way for someone, I'll back up one more step, a way to suggest that someone could use this tool
Mhm.
would be to narrow in on a relatively small number of plants, that meet a characteristic or desirable, that, somebody likes it, they think, I want this for ground cover. So is this something that's reasonable, and what are the trade-offs? And I think that this tool has an excellent opportunity to provide informed trade-off decision-making. But
Yes.
if you just go at it like you have large numbers, you're going to get buried. So you need to parse it down and then phase out that particular one. So where's the range? Is this something that makes sense at 30 feet if you've got a patch of it, or should it be in the next door neighbor's yard? I mean, depending on the kind of place you've got, or if your lot is too small, even though I like this plant, I can't do it, and you can
Mhm.
make that kind of decision based on, what are the trade-offs? And I think it's all there, but making that so that people can understand it enough and feel comfortable enough with it to do, as you say, make informed choices, I think would take a little bit of a learning curve, but I think it's definitely doable. And I think it's potentially a really powerful tool for doing this exactly that.
Well,
Because there is no, it's the sliding scale, right? There's no absolute right or no absolute wrong, almost. I mean, there are a few things that, like 99% of the time you should stay away from them, but everything else is a scale. And so you get to decide, well, can I really have a little bit of that for whatever else collection of reasons, and
Right.
Well,
The next phase of this project is for people who don't have the time or inclination to use their brains to play with this or work with it, we do need to come up with some lists. And so my next plan is we've been trying to get others involved. Like the best thing that could happen as a result of this effort is that the insurance industry or FACNet, the Fire Adapted Communities Network, says, we have to resolve this question of non-standardized methodology. Because I've got 3 publications, more recent now, that say all lists are bad, and here's why. Okay, fix it so that we can make informed recommendations to the public. In the meantime, you've got this tool that basically lays out what I could find, and it's not exhaustive. But one of the decisions I made is I am going to no longer research plant lists from everywhere that don't attribute it to a spacing recommendation. All of the organ sources were like that with no spacing recommendations. And I think that's created inaccurate expectations of the public. This is a fire-resistant plant, but then they don't say where you should plant it. So that's the first step in terms of making this useful to the public, is clarifying that the fire-resistant plant lists that are out there are problematic. The next would be to, go ahead.
Okay, let me just let you finish and then I'll ask my question.
The next thing would be to convene a group of interdisciplinary professionals, because this is the problem I have run into working with OSU, is that there's the fire community. And I sent this database to the fire community at OSU. Then there's the horticultural community, and there's the land stewardship community. They all know each other, but they don't know each other's subject matter. And the people who have been working for decades on fire-resistant landscaping plant lists are too busy to go into this and solve the problem. In fact, Amy Dittweiler right now is revising the fire-resistant landscaping book that we all use or used to use, and it's supposed to be published in June. I have no idea whether it's going to address the hazard ignition zones, but it should. By essentially trying to convene an interdisciplinary body to go through this process. And so far what they've been doing is they consult with somebody who, like in fire, who doesn't really know plants. I'm discovering the fire world doesn't really know landscaping plants. and you shouldn't expect them to. We need to have a testing source that basically says, here are the standards we're going to abide by. And that's what I'm pushing for now. And anytime anybody wants to use the generator tool, it's available for their use through my webpage, because that's the best I can do right now. And I'm kind of through with my presentation, so I don't know if you want to keep recording.
Well, let's keep recording in case we have some questions that are valuable. You actually just went in the direction that I was going to go when you were talking about validation.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered
And
if,
it needs to be,
yeah, I
it
wondered if
needs
you had,
validation because I did so much work by myself, without peer review.
yeah,
And I'm mining the literature. And in some cases, I'd say like 2 or 3% of the whole database, I made a judgment call.
mm-hmm. I wondered
And
if
probably
you, I don't know who Amy Detweiler is. I'm presuming from what you were saying, she's a landscaper.
she's the Master Gardener program, OSU extension. She services Deschutes County. We have someone named Erica Zontag, who is relatively new, but in the similar position that serves our county, our area. And she was the only one that expressed kind of interest in this, along with Rachel Whirling, who is our local native plant advocate and OSU Land Stewardship Program Director. I have consulted with her. She knows about the database. She thinks it's has incredible potential, but doesn't have the time to work on it.
Yeah, and I get that, because obviously people have the day job, whatever it is. But I'm thinking, I was thinking exactly along those lines of who might be interested in looking at this. One of the participants in our Master Climate Protector course this year is Christy Morgenthaler, who is with the Plant Society, and you probably know her. But she is incredibly well informed, it seems to me, in native plants. Now,
Yes.
this may go outside her sphere of competence, but she might be somebody who would be interested in spending some time looking at this. A couple of other people that occur to me that might have interest. One is a person who did our landscaping for us here, is Mary Phillips. I think she works for OSF right now. I'm not our OSF, but ODF right now, but I'm not sure, maybe for state parks. Other possibilities are Dan Bish with Plant Oregon, and they do a lot of landscaping stuff. And he or his son Dave might be interested in looking at it and just giving you a sense of how it feels, because that's what you want people to say is it feels right. It feels right. No, it doesn't quite feel right for this reason or that reason.
Well, I actually am not interested in whether it feels right. I want a product out there that the public can use. The database is like the back end of an engine, and we could make it user-friendly to anybody, but it needs to have that professional eye.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. Does it feel right to somebody whose life is spent making landscaping recommendations from the perspective of fire?
So what I'm doing simultaneously with developing this product is I'm developing a Rogue Valley Landscape Service Providers Directory, and I'm teaching classes. And the February 17th Landscaping Service Provider Directory, Plant Oregon was invited to it, and anybody else that we could find on lists of landscape service providers, regardless of their background, contracting status, any of that. We want to reach them all. There were at least 150 people on the list. I decided at this point that we are going to have to hold a separate training for maintenance or yard workers because they usually just do what the client tells them to do. So this was targeted at contract designers, architects, more that type of people. And in the end, 26 people attended the training from 18 companies. Plant Oregon might have been on it, or Oregon Fire Safe was. And the carrot that we held out to them was that your name will be put on a list that's posted in Ashland and Medford as having attended this training. And then they were sent a post-survey questionnaire about their impression of several things, the class itself, but also whether they thought a plant list generator like this would be of value. And they now have the link to it if they choose to play with it. So I'm trying very hard to reach the landscaping community. And I've had quite a fraction of them say, I don't want any more business. We've heard this all before. This is new information, so it's not quite true. So it's going to be a long cultural change, I think, to make this happen. And this is basically the first early stages of the process.
Yes, I get that. Trying to persuade people who think they know it all that maybe they could benefit from some new information is, it's of course a problem we have in the whole arena of the master climate protector, where lots of people are very active in the climate arena, so they think they know it all. So they don't think that they need to take a course that would help them understand more. And I get that barrier that you're confronting. Just struck me as Charisse was talking, Gary, that this is something that we should introduce Stephen Sloan to if he's not aware of it.
I agree. I had a similar thought. It would be definitely part of the mix of
Yeah.
the kinds of things that RCB is talking about, thinking about. You know, there's definitely a slot for it.
Can I ask you a question on the presentation that I gave? The latter half of it was what was presented to landscapers. The first half was presented originally in a different way by City of Ashland fire staff. And every time I have presented, I ask the question, do people need to understand fire dynamics and why we are making these recommendations? What do you think?
I
Well,
think maybe I should stop the recording because we're now getting into a slightly different arena. So I'll see if I can find out where to do that.
And I'd also be happy to make a recording sometime that's specifically tailored to an audience. The problem